Hey, Stephan Kinsella.
Hey, Jeff.
Well, we were talking about the big lawsuit this morning. You know, the Marvin Gaye suit against that the guy who sang that song, uh, Blurred Lines.
Blurred Lines.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess it's been going on for some time. And I guess the jury decided that it was just outright theft and therefore a violation of copyright. What's your sense of this?
Yeah, I think they awarded $7 million of damages, even though I think that the Marvin Gaye estate wanted 20 or something like that. Everyone's up in arms about it because they think this is outrageous. Uh, but of course, what's outrageous is copyright law. This is a fairly predictable outcome of copyright law. This is one in a series of what seem to be shocking or outrageous decisions and results of copyright law over the last several years and decades. It shouldn't be surprising at this point, but everyone acts all surprised. They want the fainting couch, when this happens. But it's really a predictable result of copyright. I sent you some links earlier to some other one of the funniest examples. Well, we know about the Men at Work song "Down Under," which they were accused of plagiarizing this "Kookaburra Sits in the Old Gum Tree" kind of folk song because it's
Yeah,
a little.
I hadn't heard this case before.
Oh yeah, there's a
I,
little whiff of that in that little flute, the flute riff in the middle of the song, and they lost in a copyright suit, and it devastated one of the singers because he thought he was accused of plagiarism, and one of his greatest legacies was just destroyed. I think he ended up dying. Some people think he committed suicide or died because of this. But one of the funniest ones was, or the craziest ones, is this famous John Cage song. It's called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Are you familiar with
yes,
that?
yeah,
Just
pure silence, right?
well, no, but now if you look at so there was another group, the Zombies or the Wombies, something like that, that did a 1 minute of silence song, and they were sued by the estate of John Cage for copying their silence. And they said, no, no,
Yeah.
no, ours isn't silence, ours is ambience, or vice versa. Yours is really ambient noise, and ours is just pure silence. And yours is analog silence, and ours is digital. And they ended up settling for over $100,000. It was crazy.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's crazy. Well, you notice this. Oh, these suits happen only when once the song becomes enormously popular.
yeah.
It seems like just an attempt by kind of has-beens to loot the newest deep pockets they can.
Right. It's. I don't know if you made this point or someone else, but it's in a way or maybe it was a Facebook comment. It's a way the old generation it keeps parasiting off of the younger generation, right? So these old washed up sort of stars that they just find a way to extend their monopoly. On the other hand, you could say that all the money, or not all, but a lot of the money made by Robin Thicke and Pharrell on this Blurred Lines, they made probably more money than they would have because of copyright in the first place. So in a way, it's just the copyright bandits shifting money around between.
That's pretty funny. Although the Blurred Line song is routinely looted, all over the country in every club and
Correct.
I mean, I was recently in Miami at some big dance party, and the DJ is sampling music so fast, sometimes 5, 10, 15 seconds of music and just turning them over and over and over in this kind of this rinse and repeat,
Right.
genre-based DJing technique that everybody uses. And it's also fast and frenzied and crazy and music on top of each other and this sampling that and that's part of the art, right?
Yeah. Well,
And
there's people all up in
there's no way
arms
that
about this,
anybody's
though.
paying attention to comment. To
Uh,
what?
like I think Bob Dylan and other people are all up in arms saying this is going to put a chilling effect on speech and creativity. Like
Well,
like the,
but these
first
but
they've heard
these
of this.
no, but these suits they date back like 40 years. I mean,
Exactly.
I just watched a video that had something like top 10 rip-offs, and they were chronicling music from like the 1950s. These suits have been going on forever, and they mostly win, and they're mostly settled, mostly out of court,
Right.
and they're mostly won by it's sort of in a way that transfers money from the newest star to the has-been star, or from the greater star to the lesser star, and everybody just moves on with history, and it hasn't stopped anything, and it won't stop anything.
Well, the most recent one before this was just a few months ago. It was this Sam Smith song. Have you heard it? It's "Stay with Me." It's a really nice sort of gospel-y sounding soul song. And Tom Petty, who had the song "I Won't Back Down," they contacted them, and I don't know if they sued or threatened to sue, but he wanted co-authorship credit, and he got it, and they paid some money.
Yeah.
And it obviously is not a copy. This is the thing you and I were talking about. Is a lot of my libertarian friends, they say this is outrageous because it's not a copy. Um, Now, on the other hand, I've had libertarian friends who said that was just a ripoff. So this shows how subjective these judgments are about whether one song is similar to another. And of course, there's always similarities, as you mentioned. This is how we learn and how music develops and how styles get developed and how themes progress. People always copy, borrow, remix from each other.
Well, what's interesting about this particular case of Blurred Lines, it's the same sort of tempo. In other words, the beats per minute are identical to "Gotta Give It Up," oh, hold on.
You're obviously making some earth-shaking comments here.
No, that doesn't. It's so. Whew.
The tempo of the songs being similar.
Yeah. So the beats per minute are identical. Okay, so you could have slowed this up and sped those. That's just sort of the way it works. That's hardly anything you steal from anybody. I also think it happened to be in the same key, but I think it's true for most pop music. Actually, it tends to be in sort of an easy key for the guitar players and stuff like that. I mean, that's just completely normal. And as for the beat itself, yeah, it's like very similar, but that's just called a genre of music. I mean, if I turn on the Google Play station for the radio station Caribbean Island Vacation, there'll be like 200 songs that sound almost identical to each other. That's just the way stuff works.
Well, and I think it depends upon who the listener is, obviously. Like I said, one of my friends said that this song is a complete ripoff of the Marvin Gaye song, and I don't really know what ripoff means. It's obviously not a duplicate, identical copy. And other people say there's no similarity whatsoever. Now, as an intermediate, I guess, listener, to me, there's some similarity. There's some kind of tribute or some kind of similar style. They both have cowbells, but they're not identical, obviously. But the fallacy is, first of all, the idea that there would be something wrong if it was close to identical. I mean, every now and then I hear a cover song. Some group will do a cover of another famous song, and I love those. Some of those are fantastic. I mean, what in the world is wrong with that?
Not just every now and then, Stephan. I mean, nowadays, if anything becomes any remotely close to being popular, there's a flurry of covers that appear almost immediately on YouTube. And once a song, by the time a song is, become number one or in the top 10, you'll find sometimes hundreds of copies of it online.
This is what all of human cultural experience is about. When we get together in church and sing hymns and Christmas carols, we're doing covers of an old song.
Yeah, doing covers, right.
For it to become popular, people have to learn it. When people sing karaoke, they're doing covers. When they hum it to themselves or sing a lullaby to their kid, they're doing covers. People have this assumption that that's plagiarism or that that's wrong if you make money off of it, I guess. I don't know why libertarians are against people making money all of a sudden. But one thing I think that would be helpful for people to understand is copyright law is not just a prohibition on so-called plagiarism or on literal reproduction. And if you simply go to just Google Copyright Act, look at Section 106, it lists the rights of the copyright holder, and it's not just reproduction. It's reproduction, but that includes literal reproduction, but also more general reproduction of elements of the original, like the plot of a novel or the plot of a book that's made into a movie, or the look and feel of a software program. But it also covers the derivative works, which is a work that's based upon the original.
Influenced by it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just influenced by it in some level. In fact, in the early part of the 20th century, among the highbrow ruling class elite set in the world of music, the presumption was that a copyright meant that you could not be influenced at all by any previous composition, which is one of the reasons that you saw the birth in the 1920s of pointillistic, 12-tone row music that was so like ridiculously original that it wasn't even familiar, and it lost. Basically that style of music ended up sort of losing massive audiences for serious music, and that was a presumption, and a lot of it extended from. I mean, there are a lot of reasons for atonalism and its rise, but part of it was this belief that originality now was required by law.
That could be, and so when people complain about the stifling effect, the effect on creative expression of these kind of decisions, it's been around for a long time. The copyright law has always distorted culture. It's given rise to so many effects that we take for granted now. The way that Hollywood cranks out one boring sequel after another to a hit movie because they have the copyright on it, and that's a safer choice than doing something more daring or original.
By the way, when one performance artist steals another, we tend to personalize it, but it's not really Marvin Gaye or whatever suing personally. What's the name, Robin Thicke or whatever, right? I mean, these are corporations suing each other.
I think in this case it was the estate of Marvin Gaye.
Right.
I'm not sure why it wasn't a record company, but yeah, it's usually not the original artist.
Yeah, so it's not even clear that the artists themselves benefit in any sense. I mean, even if they do win these suits, it's usually these are the suits versus the suits, right?
Absolutely. And another example of the way copyright could cause this forced originality when software started being treated as copyrightable subject matter in the 70s and 80s. Then you had this practice of what's called clean rooms, and a clean room means you hire a bunch of software programmers and you artificially separate them from the whole world. Like, you don't let them have access to the journals, to other companies' software programs, and you make them design their software from scratch, basically. And you keep records so you can prove that. That means so that if later on they're accused of copyright infringement because there's a feature or a subroutine of their software that is similar to what someone else has in their software, if they're accused of copyright infringement, they can prove that they didn't have access to it, and therefore they couldn't have copied it, and therefore the similarity is functional or just coincidental, or it's just of necessity. Like, if two programmers are trying to solve a similar problem, they're going to come up with a similar
solution. Which technically, I mean, how does copyright law treat that? Because you've often mentioned that IP is a kind of a universal right, regardless of whether you've been influenced by it. The standards of whether you've been influenced by something that's as a way of proving the existence of theft, but actually copyright itself can be violated even without influence, right?
No, that's so patent law. You could be. It doesn't matter whether you are even aware of the original invention that's patented. As long as you have something that's similar to what someone else has a patent on, you can be liable for infringement. In copyright, you have to have actually copied something from the original, which means you had to have access to it. That's why one of the elements of proof of a copyright lawsuit is access. You have to show. You can't just show similarity. Now, if you had an exact duplicate copy of a CD or a software program or a novel, word for word, bit for bit, then the likelihood of access is maybe presumed, because it's so unlikely that you could have done that independently and originally. But generally, you do have to establish access. So if you show access, which means if there's a popular song in the culture,
everybody's got access to that,
then you can assume access. Like, I think it was funny in the Sam Smith case. I think he said he had never heard the Tom Petty song, and maybe that's true, but it just seems strange for an actual artist or a musician to say he had never even heard this fairly popular song. It was 2 or 3 decades old, but even I've heard that song, Stand Your Ground, or whatever the Tom Petty song is. So the reason he was saying that was his lawyers had probably advised him, don't admit that you have access to it. So, yeah.
Well, there's what's funny too is that probably get away with like outright copying if you're not living in the same world and the same genre as the original, just because nobody ever takes notice of it. I mean, one of the things that's very interesting to me about um, religious liturgical music that came to be into existence in the 1970s, played in Catholic churches all over the country, is that many of the themes were drawn from sitcom theme songs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like almost weirdly identical. Definitely sort of infringement, but like nobody really took note of this. I mean, it's just not like the pop star is going to sue a religious publisher, because it's not actually competing. You know, it's just a straight out ripoff. But you and I
Right.
were talking.
Not for
Yeah,
money,
go ahead.
not for profit either. So probably they're assuming there may be a fair use defense. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. Who knows?
Yeah. But you and I were talking earlier about, I mentioned to you that almost all the music written between about 1650 and I would say about 1760 or something like that, generally considered to be the period of the Baroque. Uh, I mean, it's overwhelming. Once you look at all the composers all over Europe, they're all borrowing from each other. All the music sounds more or less kind of the same orchestrations, approaches, structures. I mean, this is how music grew up. And this is how people learned from each other. They complemented each other. But there was 110, 120 years in which almost all the music all over Europe sounded identical. Just a little bit of French flavor, a little bit of German flavor, sort of English in places, but the Baroque, and we know this just by turning on a Baroque station on Google Play or Pandora or whatever. It's like what you're going to get.
Right.
And that's hardly unusual. Imitation, is bound up with in the history of music from. Well, I was going to say from the 16th century, but really it goes back to the 12th century, and really it goes back as far as our records indicate, since the origin of notation in the 6th and 7th centuries.
Well, you and I were talking the other day about racist effects of different laws, like the drug war, etc. But in a way, if you think about the remix culture, right? It's heavily dominated by the sort of African American styles of music, hip hop and remixing, and that's one of the ones
true for 100 years. Yeah.
hardest hit by copyright law now. So in a way, even copyright law has a disparate impact upon race. So you could say copyright law is racist.
Well, and I don't know. I think you and I I've read something about this, but in many ways, you see these kind of revolts take place against copyright law in the history of 20th century music. Like jazz, initially when it came out was kind of, a marginal form of music that didn't seek to copyright itself, and then it became sort of institutionalized, and the corporations took over, the suits took over, and suddenly everything was locked down. And then after World War II, you saw the invention of sort of this bebop culture, But I think rock was that same way in its early years. But then the bebop came along in the 1950s, specifically rejecting copyright, and they would all quote each other in solos. And part of the idea, the ethos of the music was that it was in the commons, that it was not written out. That's what improvisation was all about. And but then it came to be written out, and by the 1970s, it was all over. Suddenly, all the music of the early bebop music, was locked down under IP. I mean, unsuccessfully, right? I mean, there are jazz combos playing in your hometown right now that are making use of all the old standards without any acknowledgement of or any payment of royalties, of course.
Yeah, but there are these basically copyright hitmen that go around. They'll walk into a hair salon or a restaurant, and if they hear music playing on the loudspeakers, and they will check and make sure that this company has a license, and if they don't, they'll get sued. So they go around just basically extorting money from people just for using the music that's out there.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. Well, there's also the problem that there's certain musical geniuses who can hear things one time and repeat them,
Right.
Without ever having looked at them. I mean, this is the famous story behind one of the most famous pieces of the Renaissance, rather the High Middle Ages, was a piece by Allegri called Miserere Nobis. And it was held tightly under control of the Vatican without allowing any manuscripts out. And the legend is, anyway, that if you carried it outside the Vatican, that you'd be subject to excommunication. So that even the singers, and it was sung once a year on Good Friday, even the singers were not permitted to take the manuscripts
Can you sing a little bit of it here for us? I know that you're good at this. Let's liberate this. Release it to the world.
No, it's a little bit complicated. I would require about 40 voices here. But anyway, the legend is that on Good Friday, Mozart himself went to the Vatican, heard it one time, and immediately wrote it out, of course, as any really competent musician could do, and published it. And so the edition that we have of this piece of music is actually Mozart's own edition. That's the one that's most frequently sung.
Did he publish it as his own work or just a transcription?
They just released it through his publisher. No, I mean he attributed it to Allegri and everything, but he took it out of the physical possession of the Vatican just because music is not physical. Music does not exist on a page. It exists as in the air or whatever. But anyway, Mozart was not excommunicated, as the legend goes, and some of this is apocryphal, right? The Pope, was touched and said, "Well, yes, this music belongs to the world." And just kind of let it go.
Well,
there's certain aspects of that story that seem a little bit fake, but anyway, it's a great story.
I think so too, and of course, the church, as we and I've discussed, ought to release copyright in everything that they have instead of trying to keep their information protected by copyright. I don't know if you read this part of Atlas Shrugged. Ayn Rand was a big advocate of copyright and patent, but there's a scene in Atlas Shrugged where one of the producers who's gone on strike is a guy named Richard Haley, and he's a famous composer. And,
Symphony Number 5 or whatever.
It's like Richard Haley's third,
yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Or whichever one. It was like the one that he had never finished.
Right, the one that people were whistling on the bus and singing.
Yeah, someone was humming it or whistling it on the train. And I'm thinking, well, this guy was committing copyright infringement of Richard Haley's intellectual property, according to Ayn Rand. So even she couldn't maintain a story that didn't involve infringement of IP. And in fact, when Dagny and Hank are trying to reverse engineer Galt's motor, that they found abandoned in that warehouse, that would be patent infringement, of course, according to her views on patents. So it's full of you can't consistently advocate this stuff. If you had a world that really enforced patent and copyright and fully and consistently, then the human race would just die off right away.
Yeah,
it wouldn't even survive.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, art certainly wouldn't survive. None of it. We never would have progressed. We wouldn't have gotten beyond.
We couldn't communicate. You'd have to have permission to use the alphabet. It's just you'd have to have permission to everything you wanted to do. To use clothing, to build a house, to use fire to cook food. Those are someone's ideas,
Yeah. So you're willing to concede that the lawsuit was settled correctly. You just think that the laws on which the thing was brought are inherently unjust.
Well, the law is inherently, first of all, this is statutory law or legislation, which is not like the result of a kind of common law process, which can generate more objective rules based upon concrete fact situations and trying to do justice. In these suits, you have basically a court trying to apply the words of a statute, which are just words written on paper by a bunch of legislators, which have nothing to do with justice, and they're inherently vague and ambiguous in many cases. So I don't know if there is an objectively right result. If, as a lawyer, I could see an argument made by both sides. Yeah, you could argue that it's not close enough to be copyright infringement. You could argue that it is close enough to be copyright infringement. And then the fact finder has to make a decision, which is part of the problem with the system, that it's inherently ambiguous and non-objective law. It is possible that on appeal, if this is appealed, that it will be reversed, but it may not be.
No,
And
I would think
it
it would
doesn't
just
prove what the law is. You know?
Yeah, it might be appealed, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, can you just settle? Can you just pay out sort of go away money at this point in the process?
So the jury gave an award which was less than was asked for. I think 20 million was the desired amount, and they awarded 7-something million.
Yeah.
By the way, in that John Cage case, I think that because the John Cage piece is 4 minutes and 33 seconds long, and the alleged infringing piece of silence was 1 minute, then the idea was that they owed 1/4 of the royalties, because 1 minute is about 1 minute of silence is about 1/4 of 4 minutes of silence. So the way they come up with these awards is crazy. But I think probably one of two things will happen. The corporations that own the rights to the Robin Thicke Pharrell song may go to the plaintiff, and they will say, we're going to appeal this, and we very well may win on appeal. Let's say we have a 90% chance of winning on appeal, or a 75% chance of winning on appeal, and we'll drag it out, and you may lose everything, but we'll give you $500,000 now to make it go away, to save us all trouble. So it could be settled, which would be a shame in a way, because it's going to kind of affirm the precedent that was established by the jury. It'd be better for us if they would be appealed and fought and the.
Yeah, but then again, these precedents have existed for half a century. I mean, I didn't know this entirely until just this morning when I started looking up the history of these cases. This has been going on for a very long time. It's nothing new, and it's not going to change it. Stephan, when you and I talk about this, we always get the same issue, because people try to overthink all this stuff. They go, wait a minute, without copyright, I mean, we'd be living in a world of absolute madness, where nobody could ever make any money. You'd come out with a hit song, and instantly everybody would just immediately steal it and record it and put it online, and there'd be covers all over the place, and everybody would use it, and then artists wouldn't make any money, and there would never be any new music. I mean, this is the kind of scenario all the time, but in a strange way, that does seem to be the world we're moving to. I mean, with the amount of covers that are online, and Taylor Swift, as I said, she can't come out with a new song without having hundreds of people do covers of the song, and it influences many other new songs, and somehow she's still making money. Although she's a big IP person,
Of course, they all are. I mean, or you could say the opposite. You could say that the danger is now that under a copyright system, if you do come out with a popular song and you do make millions of dollars, you're almost, I won't say almost certain, but there's a good chance that someone will come after you, a copyright troll basically, and take some of your earnings.
That's actually true, and this is a good example of
perfect
that.
Example, yeah.
Actually very, very dangerous for everybody on all sides. But a pure culture of free imitation or free emulation, I'm not sure how different it would be from the present system, except that you just sort of remove the threat and the violence from it.
I have to imagine that there's a lot of musicians. These are not sophisticated legal experts usually, but they get a sense over time from cases like this. They're basically warning shots. They want to make an example. They want to make people afraid to copy. So I can imagine a lot of young musicians and performers trying to brainstorm and come up with new ideas in the studio, and then there's this nagging concern. Wait a minute, that might sound too similar to this, or maybe some producer will say, I'm afraid that sounds too similar to this. You need to change that. So they're going to say, well, wait a minute, what can I do? What's safe? And that's got to put a big dampening effect.
Oh, it's a huge issue for, nobody thinks about this, but for band music on halftime shows, this is a big deal, because a lot of the local band directors will write their own music, right? But if the worry is that their band and which works great. They can use all kind of pop songs, and they can't afford to pay the absurd prices, that are associated with going through regular copyright channels. So they'll write halftime shows based on popular music for their own local high schools,
right?
Whatever, and no one cares, right? But the problem is then they go to a competition, and if they win the competition, they go on to a bigger competition. Next thing you know, they're performing at the Super Bowl halftime show or something like that, and then bankruptcy. It's just like then it's just absolute death and destruction that happens after something like that. So band directors get actually very intimidated by this prospect, and so what they do is they resort to writing music based on tunes in the public domain.
Right.
Folk music, hymns, familiar popular hymns that are in the public domain, and folk music, and 19th century melodies, traditional Americana and that kind of stuff. It was one of the reasons that you see halftime shows dominated by this kind of stuff rather than pop music.
Yeah, well, every now and then I talk to a defender of copyright, and if you just give an example of one of these outrageous cases, and it's obviously unjust, sometimes they'll say something like, well, just write your own music. So they want to blow the problem off. They want to say, well, why should you have to copy someone else? If you just come up with original work, then you don't have anything to worry about. So it's like they want to ignore the injustice of this.
Well, there's another fact too, Stephan, is that audiences don't actually like original music. That's a slight problem.
Well, they want to have something they like, that they're familiar with, that they can relate to.
They want something that means something to them, not just original stuff. I mean, if you've ever been to a local Christmas concert by the high school band or college band or the big church in town or whatever, you can play all the original music you want, and people will be asleep and bored and desperate to get away. But then as soon as something familiar comes along, like a Christmas medley, then suddenly everybody's faces light up, everybody's having a good time, everybody loves it. People have to have some hook into the art,
Well, I mean, another
simple, it's too freaky.
Another simple and good example is just this Happy Birthday song, right? Which we've learned it from our childhood, and we know what Happy Birthday is.
Right.
But if a song is sung in a movie, then royalties have to be paid to some copyright holder who claims copyright. I think it's Sony or someone like that claims to own this song, Happy Birthday. If you go to restaurants now, sometimes they make up this new Happy Birthday song, which is, it's okay, but it's not the original, So they do that just to avoid being sued.
So the reason I guess that you and I can sing Happy Birthday to each other in a private party, but we can't go to the local Olive Garden and hear the same thing is what? It's the difference between a private space and a commercial space, or what?
Public performance. That's a public performance. So these guys are basically extorters. They're not going to go after you and I. They can't do that. Although if you record it, if you have a video recording of your kid's birthday party and you put it on YouTube, maybe Google or YouTube may take the video down because there's a recorded copyrighted song in the background.
Yeah, but YouTube used to be a lot stricter about this stuff. It's one of the things that's actually interesting to me is how the terms of service of YouTube has changed over the last 5 years. Used to there were 2 or 3 options. I own this piece. This piece Correct. Is in the public domain. I've received the appropriate permissions. But now there's like 45 different options. And what it reminds me of, everyone a little more, different. Well, this is a cover that is using the same background, but not any images, and so on and so on. And what it reminds me is of increasing numbers of exceptions that grew up around anti-usury laws of the Middle Ages as we approach the Renaissance. It
Right.
took several hundred years, but increasingly, theologians and philosophers and jurists would make exceptions for how you could earn and pay interest under the following conditions. And eventually the law just became so weak, it became obsolete, nobody cared anymore.
I think that's one reason why the copyright industry fights for fair use law to be clarified and expanded, which a lot of people are pushing for. They're saying, listen, we need to clarify what fair use is so that we don't have to have a lawsuit every time to determine whether the use was fair. Right now there's 4 factors. The law says, the copyright law says that in the U.S. fair use, it's called fair dealing in other countries. But it lists like these 4 factors that the judge would have to consider. One is the extent of the work, one's how much it hurts the market, one's whether it's commercial or not, or educational. There's all these factors. And so there's never a bright line rule unless you have three or four of the four factors that are clear. If it's half and half, you don't know what a jury would do. So people have advocated, like, let's clarify fair use. Let's make it clear that the following types of uses, like for documentaries, whatever, could be considered fair use, and let's expand it. For example, if you own a cell phone, should you be able to unlock it and hack, to use your own SIM card in there? That's actually right now a violation of the copyright law, except for when the Librarian of Congress issues her every 3-year ruling about whether or not to include that, and she didn't last time, she did before. It's ridiculous. So I think the reason the copyright industry fights that is because they're worried about this phenomena you mentioned. If the fair use defense got stronger and broader over time, those types of defenses could end up with copyright law.
Right, and eventually the whole thing just becomes irrelevant. I mean, it's a weird kind of situation now because it's less relevant than it's ever been before. And there's never been so much imitation, so much just outright stealing.
Well, in a way, the internet itself is the biggest, is more analogous to this threat to copyright law, right? Because it's not a law, but it's a mechanism that makes it easy for people to copy and to get away with it.
Right.
So in a way, that's why the copyright industry basically wants to kill the internet. That's why they supported SOPA and PIPA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and ACTA, the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which all have draconian copyright provisions which basically would restrict internet freedom in the name of stopping copying online. They're basically trying to take the world's greatest copying machine, which is one of the greatest technological advances of all humankind, and the greatest weapon we have against the state and tyranny, and they want to restrict it and kill it and choke it off. I think actually if the copyright industry had its way, they would destroy the internet. They hate it.
Yeah, well, they probably would have done the same thing for radios, and they probably would have done the same thing for the phonograph.
The phonograph and the printing press and audio cassette recorders, the VHS. In fact, the VHS case, there's a Sony Betamax case back in the 80s. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 to uphold the legality of using your own VHS machine to record over-the-air TV broadcasts. So by one decision, by one vote, we narrowly escaped a rule that would have, in the name of copyright, it would have killed the entire way the movie and television and video rental and DVD business and now streaming business has evolved. It could have totally changed the entire movie, television, video consumption business.
Yeah, and or at least it would have slowed down development or diverted it in different directions.
It would definitely be different.
Yeah, and of course, at every stage of technological development, you hear the warnings of the impending catastrophe. Well, if this technology is unleashed, and its full potential is just permitted to enter into a world without strict enforcement, it'll mean the end of art. It'll mean the end of music, the end of movies, and so on. We always hear this gloom and doom scenarios about how piracy is going to ruin civilization.
Right. I think that if we're going to be hyperbolic, we need to go the other direction. We need to worry about the end of freedom and the end of internet freedom and the end of civil liberties and the end of culture if copyright law gets expanded and enforced the way its advocates want it to be expanded.
Yeah, literally understood. I mean, copyright is fundamentally totalitarian.
Yeah, didn't you have a tweet about that the other day that got some attention?
Well, it gets attention, but nowadays I think, thanks to you, it's now, I think, very common for people to question copyright in every respect. I mean, John Stossel had a really good show on it. I mean, it was inconclusive in some way, but you went on there and made the case. That would have been inconceivable. Like 10 years ago, that John Stossel would have held a show raising questions about intellectual property, especially within the libertarian world. Copyright has been largely unquestioned outside just a handful of thinkers. For the most part, nowadays it's completely rejected, I would say.
Well, that's what always shocks me is so you have some libertarians who are kind of on the fence and they'll say, well, patents are clearly a bad idea, but copyright is fine. And then when you point to an example like this, they'll say, well, I'm not in support of that. So you never know what, they're never in support of any particular thing, except people making music and making money somehow.
That's almost always true of defenders of any government regulation or institution or program, right? They don't actually defend the really existing thing. The thing that they defend is some abstraction that they've manufactured in their heads.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And they just brush aside the problems with it by saying, well, it could be done better.
Yeah.
We can have a more
put that theorist in charge. Well, thank you, Stephan, for hanging out with me. We should do this more often, don't you think?
I'd love to. Let's do it.
Okay. All right. Take care, my friend. Bye-bye.